So we've talked about how this group of separatists left England, went to Leiden, and so they decide, for the reasons that we've talked about, they want to come to the New World. So they have two main problems to fix to get over here. They need land to settle on, and they need funding to get them there. So the negotiations for this were long and complex. They created a lot of stress and delay. It took years of them figuring this out. At one point, the people in Holland sell all of their goods, their belongings. It took 3 years for them to make all these arrangements. So first they decide on settling in Virginia, which is, of course, much larger. It's going to be the Carolinas, Virginia, all the way up to New York. So Jamestown had already been settled, but they planned to start a new colony, a new spot in Virginia, because in that wide area, there's a lot of different places that they could settle. So they also had offers to settle under the Dutch, under Holland in the New World, because the Dutch are going to end up settling what's now New York City, and so they could have done that. They're already under Holland's control. They would be guaranteed freedom of worship. So see, it might seem a bit surprising. Why did they go back to England, back under the king who was persecuting them, and get permission from him to settle the New World? Because it's not like there was all that much competition in the New World. There were a lot of ships coming over here, but it was still open land. If they negotiate with the Indians, work with the Indians, anyone could settle here. So why did they not go under the Dutch? One reason was the Prince of Orange was not that interested in starting a colony here in competition with the English. So it may not even been possible. So that would have been one issue. The other, they probably still did consider themselves Englishmen and would be more happy to settle as Englishmen. And they did, as they were coming over here, have the hope that they would start a Puritan New England, a separatist New England, a New England under God with freedom of worship that they were looking for. And so they were more interested in doing that as Englishmen rather than as the Dutch. One of their big issues, of course, is freedom of worship. They negotiate with representatives of the English government. King James, he says, will let them settle in the New World under his dominion with freedom of worship, but he refused to put it in writing. The popes are saying, are we gonna risk our whole livelihoods, everything we have, to settle under this verbal promise from this king who has persecuted us before? And they decide to go through with it. They had good reason to distrust him, but they decide if he's gonna put it in writing, he could break that anyway. So we're just gonna trust him and move forward. Brewster actually is being persecuted as they are leaving. He has to sneak on the boat under an assumed name because he is being persecuted for a book that he's printed. We'll talk more about that later. So they first get permission to settle in Virginia, but they end up getting a new offer to settle in New England. So this area had been explored by numerous ships, most famously by Captain John Smith, who had been a man that was pretty influential in ensuring that the Jamestown colony survived. He had mapped out this place. He had called it New England. We don't know the exact terms of the patent, a lot of this, and the patent is the permission from the king to settle in a particular area and the grant of control over that. Eventually, the patent they got didn't apply, and they had to file for a new patent. My best guess of what happened is that when they left, they were in process of getting a patent and a charter for New England, but their process wasn't finished yet. And so they just planned to find a spot to settle and leave it to their contacts in England to sort out the legalities of it. And by the time they arrived in the New World, by the time they were settling here, they had already gotten their patent. Of course, they didn't know that, no wireless communication, but they did have that patent, and they did end up getting all that legal permission sorted out. But they were coming not under Virginia, but under a new group to settle in New England. What they were aiming for was the mouth of the Hudson River down by New York City, but that would have been considered New England. The other thing they need is funding. Most of the people we know as the Pilgrims were not super wealthy. There were some of them that had a little more finances to their name, but they'd already spent a lot of money to transfer to Holland. They'd try to build up businesses and livelihoods there. But they didn't need outside funding because it's very expensive to come over to the New World. Very convoluted situation, but they end up getting a group of shareholders assembled. It was headed up by a man named Thomas Weston, a man that they would have a lot of issues with as the years progressed. They were trying to negotiate settlement agreements with them, and they have representatives from their church over in England that they said exceeded their authority in making agreements. So when they're on the Mayflower and the Speedwell leaving England, they do not have an agreement signed, and they actually have to sell off some of their supplies to pay for their port charges to get out of the port, because they still don't have this agreement. Because what the shareholders, the adventurers as they were called, were requiring them to do is to work for the company for 7 years. And at the end, all the produce, all of the lands, all the houses would be divided equally between the shareholders and the settlers. But the new terms that the Pilgrims refused to was that all the houses and gardens would be kept by the company. So basically you come here, you work for 7 years, and at the end of 7 years, you end up with maybe some money, but all these houses, all these gardens you built go back to the shareholders in England. They also were not allowing them to have any days to work for their own household benefit. Everything had to be done in common. So it was basically slavery, servitude for 7 years. They leave without agreeing to these terms, but they eventually do have to agree to them. Because when they're coming over here, they're not a self-sufficient colony. For many years, they're getting all kinds of stuff from England, food, trading goods, the materials, the tools they need. They're not self-sufficient. They're going to need a lot of help. And this is their group, this is their company. They're not going to be able to negotiate a new people to fund them, so they do have to agree to these terms. This causes a lot of trouble. They have to renegotiate it numerous times. Also, this group that funded them, some of them were very sympathetic to them. Some of them were Puritans. But there were some that wanted to impose the Church of England on them. That's going to be So they have 2 ships. They bought a ship in Holland called the Speedwell that they intended to sail over here and then use it for trading along the coast and exploring along the coast. So that is their ship that the congregation there buys. They depart from Leiden off to the coast of Holland, board the Speedwell, depart with much tears, much prayers, and sail over to England. There they meet the Mayflower and the rest of the group of settlers. The Mayflower was a rented ship. It was a merchant ship. It was quite large for that time, even though when we look at it now and when we go on it in a few minutes, it's going to look pretty small. But it was large. But a few years later, when the next generation of ships comes out, they're going to be much larger, and this would be one of the smallest ships. The exact size and design aren't known. What they've done here is reconstruct a ship that was similar to what it would have been at that time. So the lifespan of these ships was only 15 years, and this was at the end of its lifespan. It was used for various things before this. I believe a lot of what it was doing was trading in wine. Its fate is not known, though it was almost certainly broken up for scrap. This replica, the Mayflower II, was built in the 1950s. It just recently got a refit for the 400th anniversary, and so it has long outlasted that original ship many times over. So, as they're leaving England, the situation was tenuous. As I said, William Brewster was wanted by the government for the books that he had printed, so he has to come on board secretly. Their shareholders are demanding that they sign, but they sail out of harbor on August 15th. But soon after they leave, there's a big problem. The Speedwell, its name is a bit ironic because it is not going so well. It was leaking. They bring it back to port. They try to fix those leaks. They go out again. 300 miles, it's leaking again very badly. They are trying to pump it. They're not keeping up. They decide if they keep going, they're going to sink. That's not what they want. So they come back to England for the second time, twice. They tried to go and had to return. The shipwrights look it over. They cannot find why it's leaking. It's a bit of a mystery. It's likely that the issue was the ship was overmasted, that she was carrying too many sails. The masts were too tall, so basically that mast was acting like a lever on the ship, opening the seams up. What they end up doing is, since they can't find the problem, they end up leaving the ship here, coaling the colony down, and going only on the Mayflower. But what they do is they are able to refit the Speedwell, and she goes on for the rest of her career without any problems. Bradford in Plymouth Plantation accuses the captain of treachery because they think that he didn't want to make this voyage because he had already been prepaid. And so he had done something to make the ship leak. That's their accusation, but irregardless, they end up going only on the Mayflower. a lot of people and provisions have to be left behind. But I think this worked providentially in the Pilgrims' benefit, because even Bradford said that it was like Gideon, that their number was cut down to a smaller number, all that they could fit on the ship. Because a lot of those who stayed were people who had lost heart and wanted to stay, who no longer wanted to make this trip to the New World. And if they couldn't stand having to return a couple times to England, they were not going to be able to stand the hardships that would await them in the New World. You have a lot of colonies that were made, and people abandoned them after facing similar difficulties that the Pilgrims faced. But the Pilgrims persevered through it and made a successful colony. So Robert Cushman, who was their agent in England, they had their issues with him, but he was from their church, and he ended up staying behind. And this is from a letter he wrote from the time. "If we ever make a plantation, God works a miracle, especially considering how scant we shall be of victuals, and most of all, ununited amongst ourselves, and devoid of good tutors and regiment. Violence will break all." And so he was very discouraged. And so when he and others leave, that disunion that he talks about ends up diminishing. And so they're able to continue with a lot more unity. The Mayflower sets off with 102 passengers, plus the crew. When you go on board, you're going to see that was a very tight fit, especially since they also had provisions for this voyage there and back, provisions to stay in this land. The settlers were 50 men, 20 women, and 32 children. Those women and children are important. This was a colony not of men, but of families. From those numbers, you know, there's a lot more men coming than women, but a lot of them had families at home that they were planning to bring over later. They're planning not to just come here, make some money, and leave. They're planning to stay and start a new country here. So those 100 passengers were not all from Leiden. We have a list of the passengers, but we don't know who they are. Historians divide them into strangers and pilgrims. The pilgrims being the separatists, and those who are coming for religious reasons, and the strangers being people who are coming just for monetary reasons, just to better themselves. Now, Bradford and the other pilgrims did not divide them up in this way, and that was for good reason. They were trying for a unified colony, even though people were coming for different reasons. He was trying to get them all to work together for a common goal. We don't know who was in which group, and we know that some from England were Puritans who were, while they did not have the conviction necessarily to be worship in a separate church, they were very happy because they shared a lot of the religious values that the separatists did. Others were, of course, coming for monetary reasons. And as I said, there's overlap. You have Miles Standish, we're going to talk more about him later, but he knew John Robinson in Holland. He likely worshiped with the church there. When he comes here, he doesn't become a member of the church, but he supports the church, and he likely sympathized with it. So when you divide up those 50 men, you have 17 from the Leiden church, 16 were servants who were working for employers, and 17 men were from England, and they're the strangers of varying degrees of attachment to the church in Leiden. And the families are pretty evenly split between those saints and those strangers. The name Pilgrims that we know them by today was not one that they chose. That is something that has been assigned later. Even of those 102 passengers, only 4, I believe, were from the church in Scrooby. And so, you know, you read the story of the Pilgrims starting in Scrooby, that is true, but it's a group that's changing over time. And so not many of those people from Scrooby end up making it over to the New World. But some pretty famous people did. Bradford, Brewster, Mary Brewster, some pretty influential people. And that is why that is the root of this settlement. So a few incidents on the voyage before we wrap up here. September 16th, the Mayflower departs England for the 3rd time, this time successfully. They head off with good winds, but there's a lot of seasickness for the passengers. This ship is not one that's going to be comfortable for people, especially those not used to the sea. There's cramped quarters for all. It would not have been very pleasant to ride on the Mayflower, but it's very likely that they did their best to keep their quarters as clean as possible. They, of course, have a lot of water to wash things. Notable that other groups coming to the New World had a lot of problems with disease even on the ship. and they do not have that. One boy, servant boy, let me get his name here, William Booton, servant of Samuel Fuller, who is the doctor and the deacon of the church in Leiden. He died, likely of this sickness that was common on ships at the time. But other than that, you have no deaths from disease among the settlers. So one of the sailors was a profane and vile man. He cursed and mocked the passengers, saying that he hoped half of them would die, and he hoped that he would be the one to throw them overboard. That man was the first to die on the voyage. He himself was the first to be thrown overboard. And the Pilgrims, of course, saw God's providential hand in this. As Bradford said, thus his curses lighted on his own head, and it was an astonishment to all his fellows, for they noted it to be the just hand of God upon him. They encounter a lot of stormy weather in the Atlantic, some so bad that they couldn't raise any sail. They have to just float through the waves, because any sail they put up would drive them too fast and risk sinking the ship. In one of these bad storms, the ship's main beam cracked. That's the beam going across the ship widthwise. The crew, the captain, and the leaders of the colony were debating, what are we going to do? Do we have to go back to England? Is it safe to continue? They determined that the ship was strong enough. And one of the settlers had a screw jack with him, and that jack would be used to jack up beams to build houses for construction purposes. Historians have said it was a printing press. That's actually not correct. It would have been used for construction. And so that they were able to use to jack up this beam and secure it in place. Another occasion during one of these storms, a man called John Holland, one of the settlers, comes up on deck. The ship is pitching, and he ends up being tossed into the sea. Providentially, a rope was hanging off into the water. That's not something that a well-disciplined crew would have done, but providentially it was there, and he was able to grab that. He's pulled deep under the water, but the sailors catch sight of him and are able to haul him back on board, pulling him in with a boat hook. His life was saved. He lived many years here in Plymouth as a faithful member of the church. So as I said, one of the settlers died, and one was born, Oceanus Hopkins. He died at age 2 here in Plymouth. Another was born after they arrived, but before they landed. The name of that child was Peregrine White, and the name Peregrine means traveler or pilgrim. So they did use the term pilgrim, but not for themselves as a group as we do. But they were very much, they did see themselves as pilgrims, so they did not use that term. And also, sadly, Dorothy Bradford, wife of William Bradford, will die once they arrive here at the New World, falling overboard and drowning. And we're not quite sure how that happened, but that's what we do know.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and share it with your friends. You can also visit www.discerninghistory.com for more videos and other resources.